My daughter-in-law had just bought 3 imported dogs when my son coldly threw my bag at my feet and kicked me out. My wife says your old man smell is making the dogs allergic. Go. I left carrying my late wife's old yellowed handwritten savings book. When I walked into the bank, the teller entered the account code, and her face suddenly went pale. "Sir, please come with me. The branch manager will see you. Thank you for joining me on Dad's Revenge Stories. I am so thankful for your presence. Which country or city are you watching from right now? Leave a quick comment below. Also, please note, this story includes some fictional elements added for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to names or settings is purely coincidental, but the message conveyed is useful." Ryan threw the bag before he finished the sentence. It hit the floor between us, with a sound I still hear sometimes when the house gets too quiet. A dull, heavy thud like something final. The duffel bag had been mine for 20 years. I had packed it for fishing trips for a long weekend in Sacramento when Helen's sister got married, for the 4 days I spent at a motel after the water heater flooded the upstairs hallway. It was old canvas army green with a broken zipper on the front pocket that I kept meaning to fix. Now it was lying at my feet in my own living room, and my son was standing 6 feet away, looking at me like I was a problem he had solved. "Vanessa says the smell of old man is giving the dogs allergies," Ryan said. "Go." I have replayed that sentence more times than I can count. Not because it surprised me by that point, very little Ryan said surprised me anymore. I replayed it because of the way he said it. Not angry, not guilty. The way you tell someone the restaurant is closed, the flight is canceled, the meeting has been moved. Flat and efficient, and already thinking about the next thing. I looked at Vanessa. She was standing near the hallway entrance with her arms crossed, and she had 2 fingers pressed lightly against the side of her nose, the way people do when they are trying to be subtle about the fact that they are not being subtle at all. Behind her, Bella and Duke were curled on the couch that had been mine for 11 years. Princess, the youngest, was asleep in a dog bed that cost more than my first month's rent in this house. The dogs had arrived 9 days ago. 3 Cavalier King Charles Spaniels, purebred, imported from a breeder in Connecticut. Vanessa had researched them for months, she told me, because they were hypoallergenic and gentle and perfect for the aesthetic of the house. She had ordered a custom feeding station, 2 air purifiers, a grooming subscription, and a refrigerated raw food delivery service. The total cost, which she mentioned, with the bright enthusiasm of someone who has never had to worry about totals, was somewhere north of $8,000 in the first month alone. She had also on day 3 taped a handwritten chore schedule to the refrigerator. My name appeared at the top of the morning column, yard cleanup, which was a polite way of writing what it actually meant. I had done it without saying anything, because that is what I had been doing for 3 years. I did the yard. I took in the packages. I cooked on the nights Vanessa did not feel like cooking, which was most nights. I fixed the garbage disposal in October, and the ceiling fan in the guest room in February, and the porch light twice because Ryan kept forgetting to replace the bulb with the right wattage. I did all of it, and I told myself it was fine, that this was what family did, that Helen would have said the same thing. Helen would not have said the same thing. I know that now. "This is my house," I said. My voice came out steady, which surprised me. Ryan exhaled through his nose. It was a sound he had perfected in his late 20s, a kind of compressed impatience, like he was generously choosing not to say everything he was thinking. "Dad, don't start. I've lived here for 32 years. The dogs have been here for 9 days, Vanessa said from the hallway. Her voice was careful and even. And they've been sneezing every morning. The vet said it could be environmental. We have to take that seriously. You're asking me to leave my house, I said, because of a vet's opinion about dogs you bought 9 days ago. We're not asking, Ryan said. I looked at my son. He was 39 years old and wearing the same expression he had worn at 14 when I told him he couldn't take the car, not angry exactly, but certain. Certain that he was right, that the conversation was a formality, that the outcome had already been decided before I opened my mouth. He stepped forward, and I flinched. I am not proud of that. I flinched because some part of me recognized something in the way he moved, and that part of me was right. He hit me open-handed hard enough that my shoulder caught the wall, and a framed photo of Helen and me at Yosemite dropped 3 inches on its nail. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Ryan bent down and picked up the duffel bag and held it out to me. His hand was not shaking. That was the part I could not get past for a long time afterward. His hand was not shaking at all. Vanessa called ahead, he said. There's a room for you at the Sunrise Motor Inn on Foothill. 2 nights paid. After that, you figure something out. I took the bag. I do not know why. Muscle memory, maybe. You hand a man something, he takes it. 32 years of keeping the peace, but I did not go to the front door. I went to the basement. Ryan said something behind me. I did not hear the words. I walked down the stairs the way I had walked down them 10,000 times, before 14 steps. The third one creaks, duck your head at the bottom, because Helen always said we should have raised that beam, and we never did. At the far end, behind the water heater, there was a wooden crate I had built in 1991 from leftover lumber. Inside it were things I had moved down here when Vanessa decided the living room needed to be, in her words, cohesive. I lifted the lid. There was the photo from our wedding. Helen in a dress she had sewn herself, because we could not afford the one she wanted. There was her wedding ring, the plain gold band she had stopped wearing when her knuckles swelled in her last years, the one she had pressed into my palm the week before she died, and said, "Keep this somewhere safe." And there, underneath both of them, was a small green savings book with a faded bank logo on the cover and pages that had gone the color of old newspaper. Helen had told me once, maybe 8 years ago, maybe more if there ever comes a day when you have nowhere left to go, take that book to the bank. She said it the way she said most important things, quietly, without drama, like she was reminding me where she kept the spare key. I had always assumed she meant a few $1,000s, something to cover an emergency. Groceries, maybe a bus ticket somewhere. I put the book in the inside pocket of my jacket right against my chest, and I carried the crate upstairs and out the front door without looking at either of them. The night air hit me and I stopped on the front step for a moment. September in Pasadena. Still warm the way it gets when summer does not know it is supposed to be leaving. The San Gabriel Mountains were a dark outline against a darker sky. 32 years I had stood on this step and watched the light change on those mountains. I walked to my truck. I set the crate in the passenger seat. I put the duffel bag in the back. I sat behind the wheel for a long time without starting the engine. Helen had told me to take the book to the bank if I ever had nowhere left to go. I had always figured she meant enough for groceries. I was about to find out just how wrong I was. The Sunrise Motor Inn on Foothill Boulevard was the kind of place that had been promising to renovate since 1987 and had gotten as far as repainting the office door. The sign out front still had the original lettering from when it opened, block letters in faded orange that someone had tried to brighten with yellow paint somewhere along the way, making the whole thing look cheerful in the specific way that things look cheerful when they are trying very hard not to look sad. I pulled in just after 9. The parking lot was half empty. A vending machine near the ice room hummed and buzzed like it was arguing with itself. The woman at the front desk was Sandra Kowalski. Her name was on a plastic badge clipped to her cardigan, the kind of badge that had been through the wash at least once. She was 50-something, with reading glasses pushed up into her hair and the particular expression of someone who had checked in enough people over the years to know without being told which ones were carrying something heavier than luggage. She looked at me. She looked at the duffel bag. She looked at the wooden crate I was holding with both arms. She did not ask a single question. "Room 7, she said. "Ground floor end of the building, quieter than the rest. Ice machine is to your left. Coffee starts at 6. She slid the key across the counter. An actual key, not a card. I had not seen an actual motel key in years. "Bathroom light takes a second to come on. Don't let it worry you." I thanked her. She nodded and went back to whatever she had been reading. Room 7 was small and clean and smelled like the kind of laundry detergent that tries to smell like outdoors. There was a double bed, a dresser with a television on top of it, a chair in the corner that was the approximate color of old mustard, and a window that looked out onto the parking lot, and beyond it, the lights of Foothill Boulevard stretching east toward Arcadia. I set the crate on the dresser. I put the duffel bag on the floor. I sat on the edge of the bed, and I looked at the wall. 3 years ago, Ryan had called me on a Sunday afternoon. He said the apartment he and Vanessa were renting in Glendale had gone up $400 a month, and the landlord was adding another $200 in fees. He said they were thinking about their options. He said, and I remember this part clearly, because I held on to it for a long time afterward, the way you hold on to things that turn out not to mean what you thought. He said, "We want to be closer to you anyway, Dad. We've been thinking we should all be together." Helen had been gone for 2 years at that point. The house had 32 years of her in it, her curtains, her garden, the particular way the kitchen smelled on Sunday mornings when she made biscuits from scratch. And I had been rattling around in it alone like a marble in a shoebox. So when Ryan said, "We want to be together," something in my chest loosened in a way I had not expected, and I said yes before he finished the sentence. The first month was fine. The second month, Ryan moved his inventory storage into the garage because his warehouse unit was expensive, and he needed somewhere temporary. Temporary lasted 14 months. By month 3, Vanessa had taken over the living room for client meetings and rearranged the furniture so her backdrop looked better on video calls. The couch where Helen and I had watched the news every night for a decade got pushed against the wall at an angle that made the whole room feel like a waiting area. By month 6, Helen's things started migrating to the basement, not all at once. That is the thing about the way it happened. It was never dramatic enough to justify saying something about. One Tuesday, the reading chair she loved disappeared from the bedroom, and I found it downstairs next to the water heater. A Thursday, her collection of ceramic birds came down from the kitchen shelf, because Vanessa said they conflicted with the aesthetic she was going for. A Saturday, the quilt she had made by hand over 2 winters ended up folded in a plastic storage bin with a label on it that said "missing." I moved the quilt back upstairs twice. Both times it came back down. Vanessa never yelled at me. That was the thing Ryan always pointed to when I tried to say something. She never raised her voice. What she did instead was sigh at the precise moment I walked into a room. She did not include me when she made grocery lists. She talked about me to Ryan in the third person when I was standing 6 feet away, the way adults talk about children who are present, but not really part of the conversation. And she instituted the chore schedule, which she called a contribution chart, because that sounded collaborative, where my name appeared at the top of every morning task, and nowhere in the evening column, which was reserved for the 2 of them. Ryan told me once when I tried to bring it up, "Dad, you don't have a job anymore. The least you can do is contribute." I had fixed the dishwasher that week, and the latch on the back gate, and the drip under the kitchen sink that had been quietly rotting the cabinet floor for longer than anyone had noticed. I had done all of it the way I had done everything for 35 years, methodically, without being asked, because that was how I was built. I sat in room 7 of the Sunrise Motor Inn and thought about all the things I had fixed in that house and said nothing about. After a while, I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and took out Helen's savings book. The cover was green, a very specific shade of institutional green that banks used to favor back when banks still printed things in green. The logo in the corner was so faded, it was mostly an outline. The pages inside were dense with handwritten figures and Helen's careful small script, deposits, interest calculations, dates, going back further than I had expected. I did not understand what I was looking at. Numbers and abbreviations and account references that meant nothing to me. Helen had always handled the finances. I handled broken things. It had been a reasonable arrangement for 35 years, and I had never questioned it. I set the book on the nightstand. Outside, a car pulled in, and its headlights swept across my window and kept going. The vending machine down the hall made a sound like it had reached a decision. Helen had kept this book for a reason. She had told me to bring it to the bank if I ever had nowhere left to go. I had nowhere left to go. I turned off the light. I lay on top of the covers because I did not feel like getting under them. I stared at the ceiling of room 7, and I thought about 32 years of Sunday mornings and ceramic birds and a quilt folded in a bin marked MISC. In the morning, I would go to the bank. I was almost certain I was going for nothing. A few $100 maybe 1,000. Enough for a week somewhere while I figured out what came next. Helen had been practical her whole life. It would be just like her to leave behind something small and useful and exactly right for the moment, without any fuss. I closed my eyes. I had no idea. I had not been inside a bank in 4 months. Helen used to handle all of it, the deposits, the transfers, the quarterly reviews, with whoever the bank assigned to our account. I would sign where she pointed and ask no questions, which was an arrangement that worked well for 35 years and left me at 68, standing in the parking lot of Pasadena Community Bank on a Tuesday morning, holding a savings book so old, the ink on the cover had faded to the color of a bruise, trying to remember if I needed a second form of ID. The bank was on Colorado Boulevard, 3 blocks east of the old post office. It was the kind of building that had been there long enough to feel permanent red brick brass fittings, a row of mature sycamores out front that the city kept threatening to trim and never did. I had driven past it 100 times without going in. Helen's bank, I always thought of it. Not mine. I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes. The morning was already warm, the way Pasadena mornings are in September when the Santa Ana winds are thinking about coming in from the east. A woman walked out of the bank carrying a deposit slip and a cup of coffee and talking on her phone, and she did not look at me, and I thought about driving away. Then I thought about the duffel bag in the back seat and the room at the Sunrise Motor Inn that was paid through Wednesday, and the fact that Ryan had not called once since the night before. I got out of the car. Inside the bank was cool and smelled like recycled air and carpet cleaner, and very faintly like the cologne of whoever had been there before me. There were 3 teller windows open. A man in a postal uniform was at the first one depositing what looked like a week's worth of money orders. An older woman at the second window was having a careful conversation about a wire transfer. I took my place in line and held Helen's savings book with both hands and waited. The teller who called me forward was young mid-20s maybe, with dark hair pulled back and a name badge that said AIM-Y in block letters. She had the bright, professional smile of someone who was good at her job and knew it. "Good morning," she said. "How can I help you today?" "I have a savings account," I said. "Or I think I do. My wife opened it. She passed away 7 years ago and I found this." I set the savings book on the counter. "I know it's old. I just want to know if it's still active." Amy picked up this book, the way you pick up something you are not sure about. She opened the cover, found the account number inside the front page, and began typing. "Can I get your name, sir? Frank Dalton. And do you have a photo ID?" I handed over my California driver's license. She typed some more. The printer behind her made a sound like it was thinking. She looked at the screen. She typed again, more slowly this time, the way people type when they want to make sure they have not made a mistake. Then she stopped. She looked at the screen for a long moment. Not the quick, practiced glance of someone confirming a balance. This was something different. Her head tilted a fraction of an inch to the left. Her fingers rested on the keyboard without pressing anything. The professional smile did not disappear all at once. It faded the way a radio signal fades when you drive too far from the station until there was nothing left of it at all. She looked at the savings book, then at the screen, then at my driver's license. "Mr. Dalton," she said, and her voice had changed, not dramatically. Not in a way most people would notice, but I had spent 35 years listening for the small sounds that meant something was wrong with an appliance, a circuit, a pipe, and I noticed. "Can you confirm your date of birth for me?" I gave it to her. She nodded and typed it in. Then she picked up the phone on her left, turned slightly away from me, and spoke quietly into it. I caught the words, "Branch manager," and "Please come to window 3, and that was all. She hung up. She looked at me with an expression I could not immediately name, not alarm exactly, not pity, something between the two, like a person who has just been handed information they are not sure how to carry. "Is there a problem with the account?" I asked. "No, sir." She hesitated. "I just need my manager to assist with this one." "Is the account closed?" "No, sir, it is not closed." "Is there something wrong with my identification?" "No, Mr. Dalton, your identification is fine." She pressed her lips together briefly. "I just want to make sure you're taken care of properly. Someone will be right with you." I stepped back from the window. The man in the postal uniform had finished his transaction and left. The older woman at the second window was folding her receipt into her purse. The bank hummed around me with the ordinary sounds of an ordinary Tuesday morning, and I stood in the middle of it holding a 30-year-old savings book and feeling for the first time in a very long time like something was about to happen that I was not prepared for. Michael Grant came through a door to the left of the teller windows. He was in his early 60s, built like someone who had played football in college and kept up with it just enough to retain the general impression. He wore a dark blue suit and a tie with a small geometric pattern and the kind of leather shoes that are polished but not showy. He walked like a man who was comfortable making decisions. "Mr. Dalton." He extended his hand. His grip was firm and brief. "I'm Michael Grant, branch manager. Thank you for coming in this morning. Would you mind stepping back to my office?" I looked at Amy. She was holding Helen's savings book in both hands, and she passed it not back to me, but forward to Michael, gently, like it was something that had moved beyond her authorization. "Mr. Grant," I said, "I'm a retired appliance repairman from Pasadena. I came in here this morning thinking my wife left me enough for maybe a month's expenses. Whatever is happening right now, I need you to tell me plainly." Michael Grant looked at me for a moment. Then he nodded, once the nod of a man who respects directness. "Let's go to my office," he said. "I'll tell you everything. But I'd rather do it sitting down." That was when my chest tightened, not with fear exactly, but with the particular feeling of standing at the top of a staircase in the dark when you cannot tell how many steps there are. I followed him through the door. Michael Grant's office had the particular tidiness of a man who made decisions for a living and did not want anything on his desk suggesting otherwise. 2 framed photographs on the credenza behind him, family I assumed, though I did not look closely. A single potted plant in the corner that was either very healthy or very fake. A leather portfolio open in front of him with papers inside that he had clearly reviewed before coming to get me. He closed the door. He gestured to the chair across from him, and I sat down. He sat across from me and placed Helen's savings book on the desk between us like an exhibit. "Mr. Dalton," he said, "before I share what I've found, I need to verify a few things. Standard procedure for accounts with extended inactivity." He looked at the portfolio. "Can you confirm your full legal name, Francis Edward Dalton? And the name of the account holder who originally opened this account?" "Helen Margaret Dalton, my wife. She passed in March of 2017. He wrote something down. "And you have no recollection of any correspondence from this bank in the years since her passing? Letters, statements, notifications of any kind?" I thought about it honestly. "I may have received things. The first year after Helen died, I didn't open much mail. I wasn't in a good place." I paused. My son was handling a lot of things at the house during that time. He said he was helping. Michael looked at me steadily when I said that last part. He did not comment on it. He simply wrote something else in the portfolio and moved on, which told me he had noted it. "All right," he said. He folded his hands on the desk. "Mr. Dalton, I want to explain what this account is before I tell you the numbers, because the numbers will make more sense with the context." "I appreciate that," I said. "Your wife opened this account 22 years ago with an initial deposit of $22,800. That money came from a personal inheritance. It's noted in the original account documentation as separate funds, meaning it was not commingled with joint marital assets. That distinction matters legally and practically." He let that land for a moment. "She did not treat it as a standard savings account. She instructed the bank to roll the funds into a series of certificates of deposit CDs, which are fixed-term instruments that earn a guaranteed interest rate over a set period, typically 6 months to 5 years. When each CD matured, instead of withdrawing, she reinvested the full balance plus interest into a new CD at the prevailing rate." He paused to make sure I was following. I nodded. "She did this consistently for over 2 decades. The bank also, at some point roughly 15 years ago, transitioned her into a tiered investment account that combined CD holdings with a conservative managed portfolio, again at her instruction. She reviewed it annually." He looked at me. "She never withdrew a single dollar, Mr. Dalton. Not once in 22 years. I thought about Helen clipping coupons on Sunday mornings at the kitchen table, reading glasses on scissors in hand, cutting out 50-cent savings on soup and paper towels. I thought about the way she folded plastic bags to reuse them and turned off lights when she left a room and bought winter coats in February when they were marked down 60%. "How much?" I said. Michael opened the portfolio to a specific page and turned it to face me. He pointed to a number at the bottom of a column. $2,100,412. I looked at it. I looked at it for a long time. The number did not change. "That's the current balance," Michael said quietly. "As of this morning, I have tried to describe what happened in my body in that moment, and I have not found the right words yet. It was not joy, not exactly. It was not relief. It was closer to the feeling I had once when I was 26 years old and working under a house in Monrovia, and I put my hand on a live wire I had not known was there, and for 1 full second, my entire nervous system lit up with something that was beyond any category I had for it. Not pain, not electricity, just the sudden total understanding that the world was larger than I had believed it to be 30 seconds earlier. I put both hands flat on my knees. "She never told me," I said. It was not an accusation. It was the only sentence I had. From the documentation, it appears she intended to, Michael said carefully. There are notes in the file indicating she planned to transfer certain information to you. Whether that conversation happened, I can't say. I nodded. I believed her. Helen did not hide things out of deception. She hid them the way she hid Christmas presents, because she wanted to give them to you properly, at the right moment, in the right way. She just ran out of time. You said the initial deposit was separate property, I said. My voice had steadied itself. 35 years of working under houses and in attic crawl spaces teaches you to keep your hands and your voice from shaking, regardless of what your chest is doing. Does that mean the full balance is mine outright? That is what the documentation supports, Michael said. Under California law, separate property and its growth remains separate property. The balance belongs to you. He paused. But Mr. Dalton, there is something else. I looked at him. The account number in that savings book, he said, is also cross-referenced in our system with a secondary record. A safe deposit box registered in Helen's name with you listed as sole successor. He closed the portfolio. The box has been maintained continuously. The fees were prepaid through an arrangement Helen made at the time she opened the box. It has not been opened since she registered it. What's in it? I asked. I don't know, he said. We don't open them. That's the point. He stood. But given everything I've just told you, I think it would be worth your time to find out. He led me through a door at the back of his office and down a short hallway with fluorescent lights and a gray floor, the part of a bank that looks nothing like the front of a bank, the part where the real business happens. At the end of the hallway was a heavy door with a keypad. Michael entered a code. The door opened. The room inside was small and cool and lined on both sides with metal boxes of different sizes, floor to ceiling, like a wall of drawers in a filing cabinet built for secrets. He found the number, Box 47. He used a bank key and the key from inside Helen's savings book, the small one I had noticed, but not understood, and the box came free from the wall with a sound like a lock releasing after a very long time. He set it on the table in the center of the room. I'll give you privacy, he said, and stepped out. I stood alone in that small, cool room and looked at the box. On the front of it, taped with a piece of yellowed Scotch tape that had dried to near transparency, was a folded piece of paper. Helen's handwriting. 7 words. Frank. Only open when you are alone. Michael Grant offered to let me open the box in the privacy room at the bank. I told him I needed to take it with me. He explained that safe deposit boxes technically could not leave the premises, but the contents could, and he gave me a large manila envelope and a pair of clean cotton gloves and left me alone in that small, cool room for 20 minutes, while I transferred everything inside onto the table, examined it, and then placed it all back in the envelope to carry out. I did not read anything in the bank. Helen had said to open it when I was alone. The bank did not feel like alone. I drove back to the Sunrise Motor Inn with the manila envelope on the passenger seat, where the wooden crate had been that morning. It was just past noon. The September sun was high and flat and white over Pasadena, the kind of midday light that makes everything look slightly overexposed, like a photograph taken without enough shadow. I bought a sandwich from the deli across the street from the motel, and I sat on the edge of the bed in room 7, and I opened the envelope. Inside was a collection of things that Helen had assembled with the same quiet precision she applied to everything. There was a stack of papers held together with a binder clip, account statements, property records, a document I did not immediately understand. There was a photograph 4x6 of a vacant lot with a chain link fence and a real estate sign in front of it. dated on the back in Helen's handwriting, October 2009. There was a small brass key on a plain ring with a paper tag that said storage unit and an address on Walnut Street in Arcadia. And there were 3 envelopes sealed, each with my name written on the front in Helen's careful cursive. The envelopes were numbered 1, 2, 3. She had thought of everything. I opened envelope 1. The letter was 2 pages written on the same yellow legal pad paper she used for grocery lists and household notes. She had pressed hard with the pen, the way she did when she was concentrating. The handwriting was steady. This was not something she had dashed off. This was something she had thought about for a long time. She started the way Helen always started things, without preamble. Frank, if you are reading this, then the day I prepared for has arrived. I want you to know I did not prepare for it, because I expected the worst. I prepared for it because I loved you, and loving someone means making sure they are protected, even from the things you hope will never happen. I set the page on my knee and looked at the wall for a moment. Then I kept reading. She wrote about Ryan. Not with anger. Helen was not built for anger the way some people are. She wrote the way she kept household accounts, methodically recording what she had observed over many years without editorializing. Ryan had taken $40 from my wallet the summer he was 17. I had never noticed. Helen noticed. She had said nothing to me because she thought it was a phase, the kind of small dishonesty teenagers commit when they want something and cannot ask. She watched to see if it would stop. It did not stop. When Ryan was 24, he sold a pocket watch that had belonged to my father. It had been in a box in the bedroom closet, the same box where I kept my father's service medals and a photograph of him in Korea. The watch was not valuable in any monetary sense. It was a plain Elgin bought in 1948, worth perhaps $60 at a pawnshop. Ryan sold it for $50. Helen found out through a neighbor whose son worked at the shop. She confronted Ryan privately. He told her the watch had been his grandfather's, and he could do what he wanted with it. He said it with complete confidence, Helen wrote. Like ownership was a matter of proximity rather than relationship. That was when I understood something important about your son, Frank. He does not take things because he needs them. He takes them because he has decided they belong to him. She wrote about the questions Ryan had begun asking in the years before she got sick. Careful questions, conversational, slipped into ordinary exchanges about dinner or the news or what needed fixing around the house. Questions about the will, about the house title, about whether Frank had life insurance and how much. Helen had answered vaguely each time and noted the questions in a notebook she kept in her desk drawer. He asked me once, she wrote, what would happen to the house if you went before me. I told him we had planned for that. He asked if he was in the plan. I said all the important things were in order. He seemed satisfied with that, which told me he had heard what he wanted to hear, rather than what I actually said. I put the letter down on the bed. I sat there and thought about the pocket watch. I had noticed it was gone once years ago. Ryan had told me he thought I had moved it. I had believed him without question because Ryan was my son, and sons do not steal their grandfather's watch and lie about it to their father's face. Except that one did. And I had looked right at the evidence and decided it meant something else. I picked the letter back up and read to the end. Helen did not tell me what to do. That was not her way. She laid out what she knew and trusted me to draw my own conclusions. The last paragraph was short. I kept these things from you, not to deceive you, but because I was afraid of what it would do to you to know them while there was nothing yet to be done. Now there is something to be done. Whatever you decide, Frank, make sure it is your decision. Not Ryan's, not anyone else's. Yours. I folded the letter and put it back in envelope 1. Then I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the piece of mail I had noticed 3 days ago, the one that had arrived the week before. Everything happened, the one I had tucked away without opening because I was tired, and there was always more mail, and I would get to it later. The return address was a life insurance company in Columbus, Ohio. The header on the letter inside said, "Change of beneficiary confirmation of update." I read my son's name where mine used to be. Underneath it was a signature line. The name typed below it was mine. The signature above it was not. I had signed my name the same way for 40 years, a capital F that leaned slightly right, a D that closed at the bottom in a small curl I had picked up from my own father. Whoever had signed this document had gotten close. They had studied it. But they had made the F straight and left the D open. My hands were steady when I put the letter down. My hands were always steady. 35 years of fine work had made them that way. But my jaw was tight enough to ache, and I sat in room 7 of the Sunrise Motor Inn and looked at my son's name on that document for a long time before I moved again. I did not sleep well. That is an understatement of the kind I have gotten good at over the years. What I mean is that I lay on top of the covers in room 7 until sometime after 3 in the morning, staring at a water stain on the ceiling that was shaped vaguely like the state of Texas, thinking about a signature on an insurance document and the specific way my son had looked at me when he held out the duffel bag. Not guilty, not angry. Completed. I had spent 35 years diagnosing problems by sound and feel a compressor that was working too hard. A capacitor that had begun to fail, a refrigerant leak so small it would take 6 months to show up on a gauge, but that I could sometimes smell before I even opened a unit. You learn doing that kind of work to trust the thing you notice before you understand why you noticed it. I had noticed something wrong with Ryan for years. I had chosen every single time to look for another explanation. Helen had not looked for another explanation. She had written down what she saw. I got up at 5:30 and made coffee with the small machine on the dresser, the kind that takes individual packets and produces something that tastes like coffee the way a photograph of a fire tastes like warmth. I sat in the mustard-colored chair by the window and read the insurance letter again in the gray early light. The document was a standard change of beneficiary form from a life insurance policy I had held for 22 years. When I originally took out the policy, I had listed Helen as the sole beneficiary. After she died, I had meant to update it and had not gotten around to it, one of those administrative tasks that sits at the back of your mind for months until you forget it is sitting there at all. The form in my hand indicated that someone had gotten around to it for me. The new beneficiary was Ryan James Dalton. The date of the change was 4 months after Helen's funeral. I thought about what Michael Grant had said when I mentioned Ryan handling mail during those first months after Helen died. He had written something down and moved on without comment. I understood now what he had written. Forging a signature on a legal document in California is a felony. I knew that much. I also knew that knowing it and doing something about it were two entirely different things, and that the moment I walked that letter into a police station, whatever happened next would be loud and public and entirely out of my control. Ryan would hire a lawyer. There would be accusations and counter-accusations, and the whole thing would become very quickly the kind of story that ends with nobody winning anything except the attorneys. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in the wooden crate with everything else. I was not ready to use it yet, but I was going to keep it. Helen had kept records for 20 years. I could keep one letter. I had been in room 7 for 3 days when Carl Henderson knocked on the door. I heard the knock and thought it was Sandra checking on something, because Sandra had developed a quiet habit of leaving a fresh cup of coffee outside my door in the mornings without knocking, and occasionally she knocked. When I opened this door, it was not Sandra. It was a man I had known for 20 years, standing on the walkway outside my room, holding a white bakery box, and looking like he had spent the last 3 days deciding whether to come. Carl Henderson was 71 years old and had lived in the house directly to the left of mine on Marengo Avenue since 2003. He was a retired electrician, which was a fact that had given us enough common ground to become the kind of neighbors who talked over the fence on weekend mornings and occasionally shared tools and left it at that. He was not a man who inserted himself into things. In 20 years, I had never once seen him insert himself into anything. He was a big man, broad across the shoulders, with white hair cut close and hands that looked like they had been built for outdoor work and never entirely recovered from it. He was wearing his weekend clothes, canvas pants, a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he was holding the bakery box with both hands, the way you hold something when you want to give your hands something to do. "Frank," he said. "Carl," I said. He looked at me for a moment. His jaw moved slightly, the way a person's jaw moves when they are deciding between two things they want to say and are not sure which one is true yet. "I was watering my tomatoes," he said finally. "Thursday evening, when it happened, I stepped back from the door. He came in. He set the bakery box on the dresser and looked around the room without comment. He pulled the mustard chair toward the bed and sat down. And I sat on the edge of the bed, and for a moment neither of us said anything because we were both men of a certain age who had learned that some things needed a breath of space before they could be said correctly. I had my phone out," Carl said. "I was going to take a picture of the early girls. They'd finally come in right." He reached into the front pocket of his flannel shirt and took out his phone. "I heard the door and I looked up. And I kept recording." He held the phone out to me. The video was 43 seconds long. The camera was slightly unsteady, the way phone videos are when someone is holding the device without thinking about holding it, pointed across the low fence between our properties toward my front door. The image was clear enough. The evening light was still good at that hour. I watched Ryan open the front door. I watched him say something no audio I could make out clearly, but I could read enough of it from the angle and the movement. I watched him reach down. I watched him throw the duffel bag. I watched myself take the impact against the door frame, and I watched the expression on Ryan's face as I did. He did not look like a man who had lost his temper. He looked like a man crossing an item off a list. I handed the phone back to Carl. My hands were steady. My hands were always steady. Carl put the phones away. He opened the bakery box. Inside were 2 blueberry muffins from the place on Lake Avenue that Helen had liked, the ones with the large grain sugar on top, that she used to split with me on Saturday mornings. "I didn't know where you'd gone," Carl said. "It took me a couple days to track down Sandra. She told me you were still here." He put one of the muffins on the dresser next to the coffee machine. "I thought you should have it, the video, in case you needed it for something." I looked at the muffin. Something moved through my chest that I did not have a clean word for, not grief exactly, not gratitude exactly, something that lived between the two and was somehow heavier than either one. "Thank you, Carl," I said. He nodded. He bit into his muffin and looked out the window at the parking lot and the boulevard beyond it. And I did the same. And we sat like that for a while, in the particular, comfortable silence of 2 men who did not need to fill every moment with words to make it mean something. I checked out of the Sunrise Motor Inn on the morning of the 4th day. Sandra was at the front desk when I brought the key back. She looked at me over the top of her reading glasses and said, "You find a place." I told her I had rented a furnished studio on Mentor Avenue month to month, nothing fancy. She nodded like that was the right answer. Then she reached under the counter and handed me a small paper bag. Inside was a blueberry muffin from the same bakery on Lake Avenue with a napkin folded underneath it. "For the road," she said. I thanked her. She waved it off and went back to her paperwork, and that was that. Some kindnesses are so straightforward, they almost hurt. The studio on Mentor Avenue was on the second floor of a building that had been a single-family home in a previous life and had been converted imperfectly into 4 units sometime in the 1980s. The ceilings were lower than I would have liked. The kitchen was a counter and a half with a 2-burner stove and a refrigerator that hummed slightly off-key, the kind of hum that told me the condenser coils needed cleaning, but that I was not going to fix because it was not my refrigerator to fix. There was one window in the main room that looked out over a neighbor's fig tree. It was small, and it was quiet, and it was mine, in the way that rented things are yours, temporarily, conditionally, but entirely. I had been there less than 4 hours when Tommy called. Tommy Miller had worked with me for 6 years before I retired, starting when he was 24, and did not yet know the difference between a contactor and a capacitor, and ending when he did solidly and could diagnose a failing compressor by ear alone. He was 34 now and running his own service calls, which I took a quiet pride in. He called me boss, which I had told him repeatedly was unnecessary, and he had never stopped, which I had eventually accepted as a personality trait rather than a habit. "Boss," he said, "I drove by the house this morning like you asked." I had called Tommy the day before and asked him to check on the property. I had not explained why. Tommy had not asked. That was one of his better qualities. "What did you see?" I asked. "Locksmith van in the driveway when I went by at 8. By noon, new hardware on the front door and the side gate. The kind you need a code for." He paused. "Also, there's a painter's truck. Somebody's doing the back bedroom." I sat down on the edge of the studio's single bed. "Which bedroom?" "The one at the end of the hall. Your old one, I think." I breathed in through my nose and out through my mouth the way Helen used to tell me to when I was getting worked up about something. It helped the same amount it always did, which was partial and imperfect, and better than nothing. "There's something else," Tommy said. "Vanessa posted something last night, on her social media. You want me to send it?" "Send it," I said. The image came through 30 seconds later. It was a photograph professionally composed the way Vanessa composed everything she put online, with the lighting adjusted and a filter applied that made the colors look warmer and softer than they actually were. In the photograph, all 3 dogs, Bella, Duke, and Princess, were arranged on the couch in the living room. My couch, the one Helen and I had picked out from a furniture store in Arcadia on a Saturday in 2011, carrying it up the front steps ourselves, because delivery was an extra $60, and we were still the kind of people who thought $60 was a meaningful amount of money. The caption read, "Finally our home feels like ours." I looked at that caption for a long time. Not because it surprised me, because it was such a complete and uncomplicated expression of the way Ryan and Vanessa had always understood the arrangement, that my presence in my own house had been the intrusion and my absence was the correction. "Boss," Tommy said, "you okay?" "I'm fine," I said. "Send me everything she posts." 10 minutes after I hung up with Tommy, my phone rang again. The number was from a downtown Pasadena area code I did not recognize. The man on the other end introduced himself as a property agent with a firm in San Marino. He said he had been contacted by a Mrs. Vanessa Dalton to conduct a preliminary market assessment of a residential property on Marengo Avenue, and that he had completed a walkthrough that morning at her invitation. He said he was calling because he had noticed while reviewing the property records before his visit that the current registered owner of the property was a Mr. Francis E. Dalton. He wanted to confirm that Mr. Francis E. Dalton was aware of and had authorized the assessment. The agent's name was Robert Hale. He had known Helen. He had sold a house 2 doors down from ours in 2014, and Helen had brought him a plate of cookies during the open house, because that was the kind of thing Helen did, and they had talked for 20 minutes about the fig trees in the neighborhood, and he had remembered her ever since. "Mr. Dalton," Robert said carefully, "I want to make sure I'm not in the middle of something I shouldn't be in the middle of." "You're not," I said, "but I appreciate the call." After I hung up, I sat with both phones, the one I had been using and the information I had just received, and I thought about what it meant that Vanessa had invited a real estate agent into my house 4 days after I left it. Under California law, a property owner's consent is required before any agent can conduct a formal market assessment for sale purposes. Vanessa had no ownership interest in the property. She had walked an agent through a house that did not belong to her and presented herself as someone with the authority to consider selling it. That told me something about how certain she was that I would not be coming back. Tommy sent me one more thing that evening. A video clip, 11 seconds, posted to Vanessa's account and deleted within 2 hours, but not before someone had saved it. The clip showed the living room. Vanessa was in the foreground, speaking to someone off-camera about fabric samples. In the background, slightly out of focus but unmistakably present, I was mopping the floor. I was wearing my gray work shirt and the baseball cap I had bought at a Dodgers game in 2007, and the expression on my face was the expression of a man who has learned to make himself small enough not to disturb anything. Vanessa's voice, clear and bright, and entirely unconscious of the cruelty in it, said, "Sorry, that's just the old man. Ignore him." I watched it twice. Then I put the phone face down on the kitchen counter and stood at the window looking out at the neighbor's fig tree for a long time, until the light outside went from gold to gray and the tree became a silhouette and I could not see it anymore. Then I picked up the phone and called Evelyn Moore. Evelyn Moore had been Helen's closest friend for 31 years, which meant she had been a quiet, permanent fixture in my life for almost as long as the house on Marengo Avenue. She had been at our kitchen table more times than I could count, drinking coffee and talking about things I mostly did not follow. The details of other people's lives, neighborhood news, the particular injustices of the local school board, which she had felt strongly about for reasons that shifted over time, but never diminished. She had been at Helen's side through 2 surgeries, 3 car accidents, involving other people, and the slow, difficult last year of Helen's life, when the days had a shape that none of us had been prepared for. I had always liked Evelyn without thinking too carefully about why. Sitting across from her at a corner table in a coffee shop on Colorado Boulevard the morning after I called her, I understood it better. She was the kind of person who looked at you when you talked, not politely, not performatively, but actually the way people looked before they had something in their hands to look at instead. She was 64 with silver hair cut short and practical, and reading glasses on a chain around her neck that she had not yet put on. She was wearing a dark green cardigan and sensible shoes, and the expression of a woman who had agreed to this meeting, knowing it was not going to be a pleasant one, and had come anyway, because Helen would have wanted her to. She had ordered a black coffee and a slice of coffee cake. She pushed the coffee cake toward the center of the table when I sat down the way Helen used to do, making space between us. "Tell me what happened," she said. I told her. Not everything, not the safe deposit box, not the numbers, not the insurance letter, but the shape of it, the dogs, the chore schedule, the duffel bag. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I had always appreciated about Evelyn. When I finished, she wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at the table for a moment. "Vanessa called me," she said. "About 8 months ago." I had not known that. I kept my face still. She said she was thinking about Helen, that she missed her. Evelyn's mouth pressed together briefly. She asked a lot of questions for someone who was just thinking about Helen. What kind of questions? Whether Helen had ever mentioned owning anything outside the house, whether she had a financial advisor, whether she had talked to me about estate planning. Evelyn looked up. She asked if Helen had ever mentioned a savings account she kept separate from yours. My coffee cup was halfway to my mouth. I set it back down. What did you tell her? I asked. I told her Helen was a very private person, and I didn't know anything about her finances. Evelyn's eyes were steady behind the frames of her glasses, which she had put on at some point without my noticing. Which was mostly true. Helen never told me the specifics, but she told me enough. What did she tell you? Evelyn reached into her purse and took out a photograph. She set it on the table between us and smoothed the edge with one finger. It was a 4x6 print, slightly faded, showing a vacant lot with a chain-link fence and a real estate sign. Two women were standing in front of the fence. One of them was Helen, younger than I had seen her in years, smiling with the particular private satisfaction of someone who has just done something they are certain about. The other was Evelyn. October of 2009, Evelyn said. She asked me to come with her. She said she wanted a witness, which I thought was a strange word for it, but that was Helen. She tapped the photograph lightly. She told me she had inherited some money from her parents, and she had decided to do something with it that was entirely hers. She said, and I remember this exactly, Frank, because it was such a Helen thing to say. She said a woman should always have something that belongs to her that nobody can argue about. I looked at the photograph. Helen was wearing the blue jacket she had owned for years, the one with the small gold buttons she had replaced herself when the originals got loose. She looked happy in a way that was different from the happiness in our family photographs, quieter, more interior. Like something she was keeping for herself. She didn't tell me the address, Evelyn said. She didn't tell me the price. She just wanted me to be there. She picked up the photograph and held it out to me. I think she wanted someone to know it had happened. I took the photograph. I turned it over. On the back, in Helen's handwriting, October 2009. Mine. One word. She had written one word on the back of that photograph, and it landed in my chest with the weight of everything she had not said out loud in 30 years of marriage. Not ours. Mine. I understood exactly what she had meant, and I was not wounded by it, and I was not surprised by it, and I was in a way I had not expected deeply proud of her for it. Did Ryan know she had bought it? I asked. He found out somehow a few years later. He came over to the house when Helen and I were having lunch on the back porch. Evelyn's voice shifted slightly, the way voices shift when they are about to say something they have been holding for a long time. He called it a waste. He said she had spent good money on a weed lot, and that if she wanted to invest, she should have talked to someone who knew what they were doing. Evelyn paused. Helen didn't say anything back to him. She just picked up her iced tea and took a long sip and looked out at the yard. And after Ryan left, she said to me, some people look at a field and see what's there. Other people look at a field and see what could be there. I sat with that for a moment. There's something else, Evelyn said. She set her coffee cup down and leaned forward slightly. After Vanessa called me the conversation about Helen's finances, I started paying attention to a few things. I have a neighbor whose son works in commercial real estate development. He mentioned a project a few months ago, a mixed-use development going in on the east side. She looked at me carefully. He said there was one parcel they hadn't been able to lock down yet, a piece of land they needed for the main access point. She stopped. So where? I asked, though something in my chest already knew. East side, she said. Near the old commercial strip. He mentioned the street. She told me the street. It was the street on the back of the photograph. I looked at Evelyn. She looked at me. Neither of us said anything for a moment, but the silence between us was not empty. It was full of the specific weight of two people realizing simultaneously that a woman who had been gone for 7 years had, from wherever she was, just changed everything. Helen always said Ryan reminded her of someone, Evelyn said quietly, walking me to my car an hour later. It took me a long time to figure out who. It was the man who used to own the building where we worked. He smiled at everybody and paid nobody fairly. She opened her car door. She never said it as a warning, Frank. She said it the way you say something when you've accepted it and moved on. Like she'd already done the math. I drove back to the studio on Mentor Avenue and sat at the small kitchen table with the photograph and the documents from the safe deposit box spread out in front of me. Helen had done the math a long time ago. Now it was my turn. The documents from the safe deposit box took me 3 hours to go through properly. I spread everything on the small kitchen table in the studio on Mentor Avenue, and I went through it the way I used to go through a service manual for a unit I had not worked on before. Methodically starting from the beginning, not skipping ahead to the conclusion, before I understood how the parts connected. Helen had organized everything in the order she wanted me to find it, which meant the order told a story even before the contents did. The first section was the purchase documentation. A grant deed dated October 14, 2009, transferring ownership of a parcel of land on East Glenarm Street in Pasadena from a holding company to Helen Margaret Dalton, an unmarried woman, as her sole and separate property. That phrase, sole and separate property, was underlined in pencil. Helen had underlined it. She wanted me to see it clearly. The parcel was described in the legal language that deeds use, which is designed to be precise and is also designed to be unreadable by anyone who did not go to law school. But the attached survey map was clear enough. Approximately 1.4 acres. Irregular shape, wider at the north end, narrowing toward the south. Bordered on the east by a commercial alley and on the west by East Glenarm Street itself. The second section was a series of property tax receipts paid annually without exception from 2009 through 2024. Helen had paid them from her personal account, the same account that had grown into $2 million. She had never missed one. There was also a paid receipt from a storage facility on Walnut Street in Arcadia, the address on the key tag from the safe deposit box, where she had apparently kept a physical copy of the deed and survey documents. 15 years of annual payments on a storage unit for a piece of land she never mentioned. I thought about that for a long time. The discipline of it. The patience. 15 years of quietly maintaining something she believed in, without acknowledgement, without assistance, without anyone telling her she had made the right call. I picked up the phone and called a property appraisal firm in Pasadena. I had found the number on a card in the back of the document folder. Helen had put it there, along with a note in her handwriting that said current as of 2021 with a phone number. Even in the way she organized a folder, she was taking care of me. The woman who answered took the parcel number and the address and told me someone would call back within the hour. They called back in 40 minutes. The appraiser I spoke with was brisk and professional and had the practiced neutrality of someone who delivers numbers for a living and has learned not to editorialize. He confirmed the parcel verified the current ownership record and told me he would need to conduct a formal assessment for a certified figure, but that based on the current market comparables and the recent development activity in that corridor, a preliminary estimate would place the parcel at approximately $3,300,000. I was sitting down when he said it. I had learned my lesson from the bank. "Can you say that again?" I asked. He said it again. $3,300,000 preliminary estimate subject to formal appraisal. He asked if I wanted to schedule the assessment. I told him yes and gave him my number and thanked him and ended the call. I set the phone on the table next to the grant deed. Helen had paid somewhere around $40,000 for that land in 2009. I had looked up comparable sales from that period the previous evening. The area had been depressed. Then the commercial strip on the east side had been struggling for years, the kind of slow decline that happens when anchor businesses leave and the smaller ones cannot carry the weight alone. Ryan had called it a weed lot. He had said it with the confidence of a man who knew the price of things and understood nothing about their value. In 15 years, the corridor had turned. New development had come in from the west side and worked its way east. Zoning changes had opened the area to mixed-use projects. A light rail extension had been approved and partially built. The weed lot on East Glenarm Street, which Helen had bought with her inheritance money while her son laughed at her judgment, was now sitting in the direct path of one of the largest commercial developments in the eastern San Gabriel Valley. Tommy called at 7 that evening. "Boss," he said, "I've been looking at that project you asked me to check. The one on the east side." I had texted Tommy the name of the development after my conversation with Evelyn and asked him to find out what he could. Tommy knew people in construction and contracting the way I knew compressors by first name and reputation. "What did you find?" I asked. "It's a big one. Mixed use, 8 stories, retail on the ground floor, residential above." He paused. "The developer put out a statement last month saying they had secured all necessary parcels, but my buddy says that's not true. He says there's one piece they still don't have, and without it, the main entrance has to go through a residential block, which the city won't approve." I already knew what he was going to say. I let him say it anyway. "It's on East Glenarm," Tommy said. "Irregular shape, about 1.5 acres. The county assessor's records show the owner as Helen M. Dalton." He stopped. "Boss, that's your wife." "I know," I said. Tommy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Does Ryan know?" I thought about Ryan standing in the kitchen doorway that last evening, arms crossed, telling me my time was over. I thought about him calling Helen's land purchase a waste. I thought about the way he had looked at the duffel bag before he threw it, the small, preparatory tightening of his hand that I had not understood at the time for what it was. "No," I said. "Ryan does not know." Another pause. Then Tommy said very carefully, the way a man speaks when he understands he is standing at the edge of something large. "What are you going to do?" I looked at the grant deed on the table. Helen Margaret Dalton, sole and separate property. Underlined in pencil by a woman who had thought about this moment before I knew the moment would come. "I'm going to take a few days," I said. "And then I'm going to do exactly what Helen would have done." Tommy did not ask what that meant. He had known me long enough to know that when I said I needed a few days, I had already decided. I thanked him and ended the call and sat at the kitchen table in the studio on Mentor Avenue for a long time. With $3.3 million of land documents spread in front of me, and the particular stillness of a man who has just understood completely and without any remaining doubt the full size of what his wife left behind. I had not walked for the sake of walking in a long time. After Helen died, I stopped doing a lot of things that had only made sense when there was someone to do them with. Walking was one of them. We used to go out on Sunday mornings, the two of us, nothing formal, just out the front door, and wherever the neighborhood took us, down Marengo to the Rose Garden, sometimes east toward the old library, sometimes just around the block twice because it was cold and the coffee was waiting. It was not exercise. It was the kind of walking you do when you are not going anywhere in particular, and that is the whole point. The morning after Tommy's call, I woke up before 5 and could not go back to sleep. I made coffee with the two-burner machine and sat at the kitchen table with the land documents until the light outside shifted from black to gray to the particular pale gold that Pasadena mornings have in late September, when the air is still clean from the night. Then I put on my shoes and went outside. I walked west on Mentor Avenue, then south on Lake, then east without any particular intention. The neighborhood was quiet in the way that neighborhoods are quiet before 7 on a weekday. A few dog walkers, a man in a reflective vest waiting at a bus stop, a bakery with its lights already on, and the smell of something warm coming through the ventilation. I had not eaten a real breakfast in 4 days. I bought a coffee and a plain roll from a woman behind the counter who did not look at me twice, which I appreciated. I kept walking. I ended up on a street I had not been on in a while, a block of older storefronts east of Lake Avenue that had been there since before I moved to Pasadena, the kind of block that survives because the rents are low enough for the kinds of businesses that do not need foot traffic to stay alive. A tax preparer, a music school with paper flyers in the window, a shop that repaired small appliances which I looked at for a moment longer than necessary. And on the corner, a second-hand shop with a hand-painted sign that said, Henderson's Resale, which was not Carl, just a coincidence of names, and a window display of furniture and lamps and household objects, arranged with more care than you usually saw in places like that. I was not going to go in. I went past the window, and I looked in the way you look into shop windows when you are walking and not really looking, just letting your eyes rest somewhere, and I stopped. In the back left corner of the window display, between a floor lamp with a dented shade and a set of ceramic canisters in harvest gold, was a sewing machine. It was a Singer treadle-style cabinet in dark walnut, with the machine head itself sitting up in the open position. The cabinet had a small scratch on the right front corner, a specific scratch shaped like a parenthesis that I had made myself in 1993 when I was moving furniture and caught the corner on the doorframe, and Helen had not spoken to me for 45 minutes, which for Helen was the equivalent of a significant argument. My coffee cup was in my hand. I did not notice I had stopped moving until the man behind me on the sidewalk said, "Excuse me," and went around me. I went inside. The man at the counter was in his 60s, heavy-set with reading glasses on a cord around his neck, and the patient expression of someone who had spent decades watching people walk into his shop, looking for something they could not quite name. "The Singer in the window," I said. "How long have you had it?" He thought about it. "Came in about 10 days ago. 10 days ago. 2 days before the dogs arrived." "Can I ask who brought it in?" He shrugged. "Young guy. Late 30s. Said it was taking up space." He reached under the counter and brought out a small binder where he kept intake photographs, a practice some resale shops used for insurance purposes and inventory tracking. He flipped to the right page and turned the binder toward me. The photograph showed the machine on the intake table. In the corner of the photograph was a timestamp and a transaction record. Paid out $85. I looked at the photograph for a long moment. $85. Helen had used that machine every Sunday morning for 26 years. $85. Not because Ryan needed the money, because he had decided it was taking up space. "How much are you asking for it?" I said. He told me. It was a fair price for what it was, a working vintage Singer in good condition, properly maintained. I paid it without negotiating. The man wrapped the cabinet in moving blankets and helped me load it into the back of my truck, which I had parked 2 blocks over, and he did not ask any questions, which I was grateful for. I drove back to the studio on Mentor Avenue and carried the machine up the stairs myself, one deliberate step at a time, and set it in the corner of the main room near the window that looked out over the neighbor's fig tree. I pulled up a chair and sat in front of it. The scratch on the right front corner was exactly where I remembered it. I put my finger on it. The walnut was smooth around it, worn to a soft finish from years of hands resting there. Helen's hands resting in the same place every Sunday morning for 26 years. Something broke open in my chest. I had been holding myself together for 10 days with the focused attention of a man who has a problem to solve and has decided that falling apart is not useful. I had kept my hands steady through the bank and the safe deposit box and the insurance letter and the clip of Vanessa's voice saying ignore him and 10 days of sleeping in rooms that were not mine. I had been careful and methodical and precise the way 35 years of fine work had taught me to be. But sitting in front of Helen's sewing machine in a rented studio on Mentor Avenue with my finger on a scratch I had made by accident in 1993, and she had forgiven me for before dinner, I stopped being careful. I put both elbows on the cabinet, and I put my face in my hands, and I cried the way a man cries when he has been waiting too long to do it. Without dignity, without restraint, my shoulders shaking and my breath coming in the ragged, uneven way that has no grace to it at all, but is the only honest response to the size of what you have lost. I cried for Helen. I cried for 26 Sunday mornings a year, for 26 years, which is 676 Sunday mornings, and I had not counted them while they were happening, because you never do. I cried for the curtains she made and the quilt she repaired, and the Halloween costume she sewed for a child whose mother was in the hospital, and the 45 minutes she did not speak to me in 1993, which I would give a great deal to have back. After a while, the crying stopped the way it always does without announcement. I sat up straight. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. I looked at the machine. I was not the same man I had been when I sat down. I was not sure yet what man I was instead. But something that had been wound very tight for a very long time had finally, in the corner of a rented room in Pasadena, let go. I picked up my phone and called Ryan. He answered on the second ring. Ryan did not answer when I called him that morning. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail, his recorded voice professional and smooth the voice he used for work calls. I did not leave a message. I sat in the studio on Mentor Avenue with the phone in my hand for a moment, then set it on the kitchen table next to Helen's land documents and decided that whatever I had wanted to say could wait until I knew better what I wanted it to accomplish. That was the first time in my life I had ever thought about a conversation with my son in those terms. What I wanted it to accomplish. It felt strange, like putting on a pair of glasses and realizing you needed them. The 2 weeks that followed had the quality of a held breath. I settled into the studio on Mentor Avenue with the minimal efficiency of a man who had lived simply his whole life and did not need much to function. I bought groceries from the store on Lake Avenue. I made coffee every morning at 5:30. I read through Helen's documents until I understood every page. I called Michael Grant twice once to ask a clarifying question about the trust structure of the investment account once, to let him know I was in the process of making some decisions and would need his assistance shortly. He told me he would be available whenever I was ready, and he said it the way competent people say things they mean. Carl brought me tomatoes from his garden on a Wednesday. He left them outside the studio door in a paper bag without knocking, which was exactly the right thing to do. I made a tomato sandwich for lunch and ate it standing at the kitchen counter, looking out at the fig tree, and it was the best thing I had eaten in 2 weeks, which said something either about Carl's tomatoes or about the state of my appetite. I did not contact Ryan. I did not contact Vanessa. I let the silence between us exist without filling it, which was something I had never been good at in 39 years of being his father. I had always been the one to reach back, to call after an argument, to show up with an apology I had not entirely finished deciding whether I owed. That was over now, and sitting with the absence of that reflex was uncomfortable in the specific way that stopping a bad habit is uncomfortable. Not because the habit was good, but because it was familiar. Ryan showed up on a Friday afternoon 2 weeks after he threw my duffel bag at my feet. I heard the knock and looked through the peephole and saw him standing in the hallway outside the studio door, holding a brown paper grocery bag in both arms and wearing a dark green polo shirt I had not seen before, pressed and neat. His hair was combed. He had shaved that morning. He looked, in other words, like a man who had made an effort, which told me this was not a casual visit. I opened the door. "And, he said. His voice was warm in a way I could not immediately locate in my memory. "I've been worried about you." I looked at him. I looked at the grocery bag. I looked at the polo shirt. "How did you find this address?" I asked. He shifted the bag slightly. "I asked around. Tommy mentioned the neighborhood." He paused. "Can I come in?" I stepped back from the door, but did not open it wider. He came in anyway, the way Ryan had always entered spaces, as though permission were a formality that courtesy required him to request, but physics did not require him to wait for. He set the grocery bag on the kitchen counter and looked around the studio with the expression of a man who is trying to appear neutral and is not entirely succeeding. "It's small," he said. "It's enough," I said. He turned to face me and arranged his features into something I recognized from his childhood, the expression he wore when he wanted something and had decided that warmth was the most efficient route to it. He had been doing it since he was 8 years old. At 8, it had been charming. At 39, it was something else. "Dad, I've been thinking a lot about what happened," he said. "Things got out of hand. Vanessa and I both know that." My phone buzzed on the kitchen table. I looked at it. Vanessa. I let it ring. Ryan watched me let it ring. "She wants to talk to you," he said. "I know," I said. The phone stopped. Then 30 seconds later it buzzed again. I picked it up this time because I wanted to hear what she would say. "Dad." Her voice was soft and carefully modulated, the voice she used for difficult clients. "The babies have been asking for you." She paused to let that land. "Bella keeps going to your old room and sniffing at the door." I thought about Bella sniffing at the door of a room that had been sanded and repainted and fitted with new locks within 4 days of my leaving it. I thought about Vanessa's caption, "Finally, our home feels like ours." "That's good to know," I said, and ended the call. Ryan was watching me with the particular attention of a man trying to read a document he does not have clearance for. He had come here with a plan, and the plan was not going the way plans go when the other person behaves predictably. I was not behaving predictably. I could see that this bothered him in a way he was working hard not to show. He reached into the grocery bag and began placing items on the counter. A rotisserie chicken still warm, a container of potato salad from the deli, a 6-pack of beer, the brand I had stopped drinking 12 years ago after a doctor's appointment, which meant Ryan had either not known or not remembered, and I was not sure which was worse. A card in a small envelope with a sunflower on the front. "I thought we could eat together," he said. "Talk things through." I looked at the food on my kitchen counter. I thought about what Helen had written in her first letter. He does not take things because he needs them. He takes them because he has decided they belong to him. I thought about the sewing machine in the corner of the room behind me, which Ryan could not see from where he was standing, but which I was aware of the way you are aware of something that matters. "Ryan," I said, "why did you come here today?" He straightened slightly. "I told you. I've been worried." "You've been worried for 2 weeks," I said. "What changed this week?" Something moved behind his eyes. It was quick and he covered it quickly, but I had spent 39 years watching my son's face, and I knew what covered things looked like on it. "Nothing changed," he said. "I just wanted to see you." I nodded slowly. I picked up the six-pack of beer and the rotisserie chicken and the potato salad and the card with the sunflower on the front. And I carried them all back to the grocery bag, and I set the bag on the floor just outside the studio door in the hallway. Ryan stared at me. "I appreciate you coming," I said, "but I think you should go." His jaw tightened. The warmth left his face the way water leaves a glass completely and without residue. What was underneath it was the face I recognized from the doorway on Marengo Avenue 2 weeks ago. The face of a man who had completed a task and found unexpectedly that it was not yet done. "Dad," he said. His voice had dropped. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" "I'm asking you to leave," I said. Politely. "For now." He looked at the grocery bag in the hallway. He looked at me. He looked at the studio, the documents on the kitchen table, the sewing machine in the corner that he had not recognized yet, or perhaps had not looked at closely enough to recognize. Then he picked up the bag and left. I closed the door and stood with my back against it for a moment, breathing in through my nose and out through my mouth. He had come because something had changed. He just did not know yet what it was. You are listening to Dad's Revenge Stories. Before I reveal the confrontation that changed everything, comment justice or the number 1 below, so I know you are still here with me. Please note the upcoming part contains dramatized fictional elements that may not reflect actual events. If you prefer not to continue, you may exit the video right here. He came back the next morning. No grocery bag this time. No pressed polo shirt. He was wearing the clothes he wore on weekends, when he was not trying to make an impression: dark jeans, a gray pullover, the kind of casual that is still slightly too put together to be actually casual. He knocked twice hard, the way you knock when you are not asking permission so much as announcing arrival. I had been up since 5. I was on my second cup of coffee sitting at the kitchen table with Helen's land documents, which I had been reviewing again. Not because I did not understand them, but because there was something steadying about returning to facts when everything else felt like it was moving. I heard the knock. I already knew who it was. I opened the door. Ryan looked at me without the warmth from the day before, without the carefully arranged concern. He looked at me the way he had looked at me on Marengo Avenue, directly, impatiently, as though the distance between what he wanted and what he currently had was a problem of logistics rather than anything more complicated. "We need to talk," he said. "Come in," I said. He came in and stood in the middle of the studio with his hands in his pockets, looking around the room the way he had not looked around it the day before, more carefully, this time taking inventory. His eyes stopped on the sewing machine in the corner. Something crossed his face, recognition, then a quick recalibration, then nothing. He looked away from it. He looked at the documents on the kitchen table instead. "What is all that?" he said. "Papers," I said. He pulled out the chair across from where I had been sitting and sat down without being invited. I sat across from him and picked up my coffee cup and waited. I had learned something in the last 2 weeks about waiting. It was harder than I had expected and more useful than I had imagined. Ryan leaned forward with his elbows on the table. "Dad, I know you went to the bank. I know something happened there. I need you to tell me what it was." "Why?" I said. He exhaled. "Because you're my father, and I'm worried about you." "You said that yesterday," I said. "With a rotisserie chicken." His jaw tightened. "I'm serious." "So am I," I said. He was quiet for a moment, reassembling. Ryan had always been good at reassembling. It was one of the things I had admired about him when he was younger, before I understood that the speed of the reassembly was itself the problem, that a person who could recover from anything that fast had never really been shaken by it in the first place. "Look," he said, "I heard from someone that you met with the branch manager at Pasadena Community Bank multiple times. That's not nothing, Dad. If Mom left you something, if there's money involved, I think as your son, I have a right to know what we're dealing with." I looked at him across the kitchen table. Outside, someone on Mentor Avenue was backing a truck out of a driveway, the backup beeper going in steady intervals, and a dog somewhere on the block was objecting to this at length. "What we're dealing with," I said. "You know what I mean." "I want to hear you say it," I said. He sat back. The patience he had been maintaining cracked slightly at the edges, the way old paint cracks when the temperature changes. "I'm the only son you have, Dad. Whatever Mom left belongs to the family. That means me. That means I should be part of whatever decisions you're making." I put my coffee cup down on the table. I looked at my son, 39 years old, sitting in a chair in my rented studio, telling me that his mother's savings belonged to him, because he was the family, and I apparently was not the part that counted. "Ryan," I said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." He nodded, which meant he had already decided to answer, however was most useful rather than most honest. "The night you put me out of the house," I said. "The night you threw my bag at my feet and told me Vanessa said my smell was bothering the dogs." I paused. "Do you regret it?" He did not answer immediately. I gave him the silence. I let it sit between us and expand the way silence does when nobody fills it, until it had taken up most of the room. Then Ryan said, "If you'd just left when I asked, I wouldn't have had to do anything." The words landed in the studio the way a dropped tool lands on a concrete floor, loud, flat, without echo. I sat with them for a moment. I wanted to make sure I had heard correctly, and I had. Not "I am sorry." Not "I lost my temper." Not even a deflection that had the shape of regret without the substance. What he had given me was a statement of cause and effect, in which I was the cause, and he was a reasonable response. He had hit his father in the face, and what he regretted was that I had made it necessary. "That's what I thought," I said. Ryan leaned forward again. The pretense of warmth was completely gone now, and what replaced it was something I recognized, the focused, transactional intensity he brought to negotiations at work, which he had described to me once with pride as his best professional quality. "Whatever Mom left you, you don't have the skills or the time to manage it correctly, and you know that." He spread his hands on the table. "I do. Vanessa and I have plans, real plans, and the capital to back them would change everything for us. For the family." I thought about Helen writing in her yellow legal pad notebook. "He does not take things because he needs them. He takes them because he has decided they belong to him." I thought about the pocket watch he had sold for $50. I thought about the signature on the insurance form. I thought about the sewing machine he had sold for $85 to a man on a side street because it was taking up space. "Jetisine," I said, "your mother worked her whole life. She saved for 22 years. She paid property taxes on a piece of land for 15 years without telling a single person why. She did all of that quietly, carefully, and completely on her own." I stopped. "And you sold her sewing machine for $85. He blinked. He looked at the corner of the room. He looked at the Singer cabinet in the walnut case with the scratch on the right front corner. He understood then where I had been on Thursday morning. Something moved through his expression that I watched carefully because I wanted to know what it was. It was not shame. I had hoped in some part of myself I had not fully examined that it might be shame, because shame at least suggests awareness. What it was instead was recalculation. He was deciding how to use the information that I knew rather than feeling anything about the fact of what he had done. That told me everything I had been waiting to know. "I think you should go," I said. "And I think the next time we speak, it should be with attorneys present on both sides." Ryan stood up slowly. He looked at me for a long moment, and I looked back at him. And in that moment, I think we both understood that something between us had ended, not in this room, not even on the night he threw the duffel bag, but a long time ago in ways that neither of us had been willing to name. "You're really going to do this," he said. It was not a question. "I'm going to do what your mother prepared me to do," I said. "Not a thing more, and not a thing less." He left without another word. I heard his footsteps down the hallway stairs, quick and hard, the footsteps of a man who is angry and has decided that anger is the appropriate response to not getting what he wanted. I sat back down at the kitchen table. I pulled the land documents toward me. Then I reached into the wooden crate beside the table and took out the third and final sealed envelope from Helen's safe deposit box, the one I had been carrying for 2 weeks, without opening the one she had marked, with a small number 3 in the bottom right corner of the front, the one underneath which she had written in her careful cursive read, "This one last. When you are ready." I turned it over in my hands. I was ready. The envelope was lighter than the others. I noticed that before I opened it, the way it sat in my hand, almost weightless compared to the first 2, which had been thick with pages and records, and the accumulated evidence of a woman who had been watching and waiting and writing things down for a very long time. This one was thin. 1 page, maybe 2. Helen had said what she needed to say in the first 2 letters. Whatever was left was the part she had saved because it was the hardest to write, not because there was more of it. I sat at the kitchen table in the studio on Mentor Avenue with Ryan's footsteps still fading in my memory and the September light coming through the window over the fig tree. At the angle it came at this hour, low and golden, the kind of light that made everything look like it was being remembered rather than experienced. I slid my finger under the seal. 1 page. Helen's handwriting, the careful cursive she had used her whole life, slightly more deliberate here than in the first 2 letters, each word. Given a little more space than usual, as though she had slowed down to make sure every letter was exactly right. She did not begin with my name this time. She began the way she began conversations that mattered in the middle of the thought, as though we had already been talking for a while, and she was getting to the part she actually meant. "I know you just came from somewhere difficult. I know because the only way you would be reading this letter is if you had already read the others, and the others were not easy. So let me be quick because you have always hated it when I take too long to get to the point. And today I am going to give you that." I almost laughed. Even in a letter she had written years before her death to be opened, at a moment she could not have predicted, she was still teasing me about the way I fidgeted during long stories. 35 years, and she had still not let that go. I was grateful beyond what I could express that she had not. "Do not use what I left you to hurt Ryan." I read that sentence twice. Not because I had not understood it the first time, but because I wanted to make sure I understood what she was and was not saying. I do not mean protect him from consequences. I mean, do not make the money into a weapon. Do not use it to punish him the way he has punished you, because if you do, then for the rest of your life the money will mean Ryan, and it should mean something better than that. It should mean Sunday mornings. It should mean the house on Marengo when we were young and didn't have enough and were happy anyway. It should mean you frank, free and clear and nobody's problem to solve. My throat tightened. I pressed my lips together and kept reading. "Here is what I want you to understand. I did not save that money because I was afraid of you. I saved it because I was afraid for you. There is a difference, and it matters. You have spent your whole life taking care of things that were broken and asking nothing in return, and the world is full of people who will let a man do that indefinitely if he does not eventually put down his tools and say, "This one is not mine to fix." I put the page down on the table for a moment. I looked at my hands, the hands of a man who had spent 35 years with tools in them, with wrenches and wire strippers and refrigerant gauges, hands that had fixed 1,000 broken things in 1,000 different houses, and come home every evening to the one house where something was slowly, quietly breaking that I had told myself for years I could not see. I picked the page back up. Ryan is not broken, Frank. He is finished. There is a difference there too, and I need you to know it before you spend the next 10 years trying to repair something that was never damaged in the first place. It was built this way by choices he made long before either of us wanted to admit it. You cannot fix a person who does not believe anything in them needs fixing. You can only decide how much of yourself you spend trying. I had to stop again. Not because the words were hard to read, because they were so precisely right that reading them felt like being handed something I had been reaching for without knowing the shape of it. Helen had written this, had sat somewhere at some table in some year I could not identify, and had thought through to the bottom of it and written it down so that I would have it when I needed it. She had known I would need it. She had known because she had known me for 35 years, and she had known Ryan for 39, and she had been paying attention when the rest of us were looking away. I read the last paragraph. The land, the money, the account, none of it is about Ryan. None of it was ever about Ryan. It is about you having something that is entirely yours, that no one can argue about, that no one can decide for you, that no one can put in a storage box in the basement and label MISC. Use it to live, Frank. Use it well. And when you are lonely, not if, when, because you will be, do not confuse being alone with being unworthy of company. You are the best man I have ever known, and I need you to act like it. All my love, always. Helen. I folded the letter along its original creases. I held it in both hands for a moment. Outside on Mentor Avenue, the morning was continuing, cars moving, a lawnmower starting up somewhere on the block. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary Saturday in Pasadena that had no idea what was happening at a small kitchen table on the second floor of a converted house. I thought about the words she had written on the back of the photograph of the vacant lot. Mine. One word, and now I understood it completely. It was not exclusion. It was not secrecy. It was a woman who had spent her whole life in the first-person plural, we, us, ours, claiming one small corner of the world in the first person, singular, not to take anything away from anyone, but to make sure that when the time came, there would be something left that was purely and entirely hers to give. She had given it to me. I put the letter in the wooden crate beside the first two, beside the wedding photograph, and the gold ring and the savings book with the faded green cover. I closed the lid of the crate. Then I sat up straight in the chair, the way my father had taught me to sit when I was 7 years old, and he said, "A man who slouches is a man who has already given up." And I picked up my phone and called Michael Grant. He answered on the second ring. "Mr. Dalton," he said. "I've been expecting your call." "I know," I said. "I'm ready to talk about the land." A brief pause, the pause of a man who had been in banking long enough to recognize the sound of a decision that had already been made. "I'll have everything prepared for Monday morning," he said. "Monday morning," I said. "Thank you, Michael." I ended the call and set the phone on the table. The light through the window had shifted while I was reading higher now, whiter, the gold hour gone. The fig tree outside was just a fig tree again. The studio was just a studio. And I was just a 68-year-old retired appliance repairman from Pasadena, sitting at a kitchen table with $5.4 million in assets, and one letter from his wife that was worth more than all of it. I made another cup of coffee. Monday was 2 days away. I had things to do. Monday morning came in cool and clear, the way Pasadena mornings come in October when the summer has finally decided to leave, and the air has that particular quality of starting over. I was at the bank on Colorado Boulevard by 8:15. Michael Grant was already in his office with 2 cups of coffee on the table and a folder that was considerably thicker than the one he had used the first time we met. He stood when I came in, shook my hand, and gestured to the chair across from him. He did not make small talk. I appreciated that. I was not in a small talk mood. He opened the folder. "I've taken the liberty of pulling together the relevant documentation," he said. "The property records the chain of title going back to the original purchase in 2009, the current tax assessment, and a preliminary title report we ordered on Friday." He slid the papers across the table one section at a time. "Everything is clean. No liens, no encumbrances, no competing claims. The parcel is yours, outright free and clear." I looked at the preliminary title report. It was 40 pages long, and I understood approximately 12 of them, but the summary page at the front was clear enough. Helen Margaret Dalton, sole and separate property transferred by operation of law to Francis Edward Dalton upon death of owner in March 2017. A chain of ownership as clean and unbroken as a piece of wire. The developer has been in contact," Michael said. He folded his hands on the desk. "Their attorney reached out to our legal department on Friday afternoon after the title search was initiated. They are highly motivated." "How motivated?" I said. "Motivated enough that their attorney called twice before noon on Friday." He allowed himself a small, precise smile. "I told them you would be available Monday morning." He picked up the phone on his desk and dialed a number he had clearly already prepared. He passed the handset across the table to me without explanation. The man who answered identified himself as the Director of Acquisitions for the development company. He was professional and direct, and had the focused energy of someone whose project timeline was under pressure. He told me he understood I was the sole owner of the parcel on East Glenarm Street. He told me the parcel was critical to the project's primary access configuration. He told me they had budgeted for this acquisition and were prepared to move quickly. He mentioned a number, $3,300,000. Cash purchase. 30-day close. No contingencies. I held the phone and looked at Michael across the desk. Michael's expression did not change, which told me this was the number he had expected, and that it was the right one. "I have one question," I said into the phone. "Of course," the man said. "My son works with a furniture supplier on your project. His name is Ryan Dalton. Does that affect anything about this transaction?" A pause. Brief and businesslike. "Mr. Dalton, we purchased land from the legal owner of record. Your son's professional relationship with one of our vendors has no bearing on this negotiation." "I wanted to be clear," I said. "We appreciate that," he said. "Does the number work for you?" I thought about Helen paying property taxes on a piece of land for 15 years without telling a soul. I thought about Ryan calling it a weed lot. I thought about a woman who had looked at a field and seen what could be there. "The number works," I said. Michael took the phone back and handled the next 10 minutes with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been doing this for 3 decades. Terms confirmed. Attorneys to be engaged by end of day. Purchase and sale agreement to be drafted and circulated within 48 hours. Preliminary title report already in hand. Under California law, a standard residential land transaction required a minimum of 30 days to close accounting for escrow title insurance and the recording of the grant deed with the Los Angeles County Recorder's Office. The parcel was not residential, but the escrow process was similar. 30 days was achievable. When Michael ended the call, he poured us both more coffee from the carafe on his credenza and sat back in his chair. "Helen would have liked this," he said. I looked at him. I had not known Michael Grant knew Helen. "She came in once," he said, "about 6 years before she passed. She wanted to review the investment account performance. I happened to be the one who walked her through it." He picked up his coffee. "She was one of the most prepared clients I've ever worked with. She had questions written down in a small green notebook. She knew exactly what she wanted to know and exactly what she didn't need to be told." He paused. "She asked me once what I thought about the land parcel, whether it was a sound investment." "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her the area was depressed and the timing was uncertain and that there were no guarantees." He looked at me steadily. "She listened to all of that. Then she said, 'That's all right. I'm not buying it for right now. I'm buying it for later.'" He set down his cup. She was right. I drove back to the studio on Mentor Avenue and sat at the kitchen table with the purchase and sale agreement summary Michael had given me to review before the attorneys drafted the full document. $3,300,000. 30-day close. My name on the seller line printed cleanly with a blank signature line underneath it that I would fill in when the full agreement arrived. That evening Ryan called. I had expected it. I had not expected it quite so soon, which meant someone had talked, or Ryan had made enough calls to enough people in the right places to pick up the scent of a transaction in motion. He had always been good at that, at knowing when money was moving before anyone had announced it. I let it ring through to voicemail. He called again. I let it ring again. The third time he left a message. I listened to the first 3 seconds, his voice tight and controlled, the voice of a man trying very hard to sound calm. I saved it without listening to the rest. There would be time for that conversation. When I chose to have it, and not before. I made dinner from what I had in the studio kitchen: eggs and toast, the bachelor meal I had not made in 35 years of marriage. It tasted exactly as I remembered. Simple, sufficient, entirely my own. I washed the pan, dried it, and put it back on the hook above the 2-burner stove. Then I sat down and opened my laptop and searched for attorneys who specialized in California residential property law and estate administration, because Michael had recommended I have independent counsel before the purchase and sale agreement was finalized, and Michael's recommendations had so far been worth following. I found 3 names. I wrote them down on the inside cover of Helen's green savings book, which I had taken to carrying in my jacket pocket, the way some men carry a wallet photograph. Not because I needed to look at it, but because I wanted to know it was there. I circled the first name. In the morning, I would call. Tonight, I had eggs and toast and $3.3 million in a 30-day escrow and 1 voicemail from my son that I was not ready to answer. It was by any measure I could apply a better evening than the one 3 weeks ago, when I had sat in this same chair and wondered if I had enough left for a security deposit. I called the attorney at 8 the next morning. Her name was Patricia Okafor, and she had been practicing property and estate law in Pasadena for 22 years, which was long enough to have seen most of what people did to each other over houses and money and the complicated territory where the two overlapped. Her assistant put me through immediately, which suggested Michael Grant had already made a call on my behalf, which was the kind of thing Michael Grant apparently did without being asked. Patricia listened to the situation, in the order I presented it: the house, the 3 years, the night of September 20th, the safe deposit box, the documents, the insurance form with the forged signature, the purchase and sale agreement now in escrow. She did not interrupt. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment in the way of someone who is not uncertain, but is being precise. "Mr. Dalton," she said, "the first thing we need to do is straightforward. Your son and daughter-in-law have been living in your property for more than 12 months without a written lease agreement. Under California Civil Code, Section 1946.1, that means you are required to provide a minimum of 60 days written notice before they are legally obligated to vacate." 60 days, I said. 60 days from the date of service, she said. "The notice must be in writing, must specify the date by which the property must be vacated, and must be properly served, either by personal delivery, by posting and mailing, or by a licensed process server. If they do not vacate by the deadline, you would file for unlawful detainer in Los Angeles Superior Court, which initiates the formal eviction process. What happens if they refuse to leave? So then the court issues a judgment, and the sheriff's department executes a lockout." Her voice was matter-of-fact. "But in my experience, a properly drafted notice from an attorney, particularly one that makes clear the owner is aware of all relevant facts, tends to produce compliance before that stage." I thought about Ryan standing in the doorway on Marengo Avenue, as certain as a man could be that the outcome had already been decided. I thought about what it would do to that certainty to receive a formal legal notice on official letterhead. "Draft it," I said. She had it ready by noon the following day. It stated that Francis Edward Dalton, the sole legal owner of the property on Marengo Avenue in Pasadena, California, hereby provided notice to Ryan James Dalton and Vanessa Claire Dalton that they were required to vacate the premises no later than 60 days from the date of service. 2 pages, precise and complete. I read it twice. Then I signed the authorization for service. The process server delivered it on the afternoon of October 10th. Ryan had been home. He had accepted the document. The server noted he had read the first paragraph while still standing at the door. Ryan called me 43 seconds later. "Dad." His voice had the particular tight control of a man who is very angry and has decided that anger is currently less useful than the appearance of reason. "What is this?" "It's a 60-day notice," I said. "Patricia Okafor's information is on the letterhead if you have questions about the legal specifics." "You're evicting me." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. The first crack I had heard in it since the night he threw the duffel bag. "I'm exercising my rights as the legal owner of my property," I said. "You have 60 days. That's more time than you gave me." He hung up. Vanessa called 11 minutes later. On the third call, I picked up. Her voice was raw in the way voices get when a plan has come apart, and there is not yet a new plan to replace it. "You can't do this. We have a life here. You can't just throw us out." I thought about a duffel bag hitting a floor. I thought about 11 seconds of video in which a woman said "ignore him" without looking up from her conversation. "The notice gives you 60 days, I said. "That's enough time to make other arrangements." "Where are we supposed to go?" "I don't know, Vanessa," I said. I didn't know where I was supposed to go either. I found a place. She hung up. That evening, Carl sent me a screenshot. Vanessa had posted a photograph of the 3 dogs on my couch with the caption, "Some people show their true colors when you least expect it." I saved it without commenting. She deleted it 6 hours later. By then, 4 people I knew had already sent it to me. I lay on the bed in the studio on Mentor Avenue and felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Not happiness, not relief, but the particular steadiness of a man who has done the next right thing and is not afraid of what comes after. My house was next. Tommy called me at 2 in the afternoon on the day they moved out. I had not gone to the house. I had decided that early that I would not stand on the sidewalk watching, would not drive past, slowly, would not do anything that turned someone else's humiliation into my entertainment. That was not what Helen had left me money for. "They're done," Tommy said. Truck just pulled away. I drove over 20 minutes later. The street was quiet. October light low and amber hitting the front of the house the way it always did at this hour. The way I had watched it hit that house for 32 years without knowing I was memorizing it. I parked and sat in the truck for a moment. Then I got out and walked to the front door and put my key in the lock. The new lock. My attorney had obtained the spare key code through the notice process, and I had a locksmith change everything back to my own hardware the morning after the move-out deadline. I turned the key. The door opened. The smell hit me first. Fresh paint and someone else's cleaning products, and underneath both of those, very faintly, the particular smell of a house that had been emptied in a hurry. They had taken things that were not theirs. I had expected that. Patricia had expected that. There would be a process for it later. I walked through every room slowly. In the kitchen, the cabinet where Helen kept her good dishes was bare. In the hallway, the hook where my father's old work jacket had hung for 15 years was empty. In the back bedroom, the walls were painted a gray that Helen would have described as the color of an overcast Tuesday, and the carpet had been pulled up, and the subfloor underneath had 3 new screw holes where Vanessa's dog furniture had been bolted down. I stood in the middle of that room for a long time. Then I walked to the kitchen windowsill. Between the glass and the curtain, rod pressed flat and slightly curled at the corners, was a photograph. Helen and me the summer we bought the house. She was laughing at something I had said. I reached out and picked it up and held it. I put it in my shirt pocket right against my chest and walked back through the front door into the October afternoon. My house. Tommy showed up the following Saturday with 2 gallons of paint and a bag of hardware, and did not ask whether I needed help. He just walked in and looked at the back bedroom and said, "What color?" I showed him the paint chip I had been carrying in my shirt pocket since the day I came back. A warm ivory, almost cream. The color Helen had picked out at the hardware store in 2012 for this exact room, the color we had never gotten around to using, because something else always needed doing first. We painted for most of the morning without talking much. That was comfortable in the way that working alongside someone always is when both people know what they are doing. By afternoon, the room was done. I brought up the bookshelves from the basement, the oak ones Helen had found at an estate sale in Monrovia, sanded herself, and stained to match the hallway floor. Tommy helped me anchor them to the wall. I arranged the books the way Helen had always arranged them, not by any system anyone else would recognize, just the order that had made sense to her. The singer went in the corner near the window. I set the wedding photograph on the middle shelf where it caught the afternoon light. I hung the picture of Helen in front of the vacant lot, the one Evelyn had given me, on the wall above the machine. I stood in the doorway and looked at the room. It smelled like fresh paint and old wood, and very faintly underneath everything like the cedar of Helen's jewelry box. Tommy stood beside me. "That's a good room," he said. "Yes," I said. "It is." My phone rang that evening. Ryan. I saved the voicemail without listening. In the morning, there was still one conversation left. Ryan came on a Saturday morning in early December. He did not knock the way he used to knock, hard, and certain, the knock of a man who expected the door to open. He knocked once quietly and waited. I heard it from the reading room where I had been sitting with coffee and a book since 6, and I sat for a moment before I got up. I opened the door. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, he was still the same size he had always been. But something behind his eyes had gone out, the specific light of a man who has always been certain he would get what he wanted, and has recently discovered that certainty was never a guarantee. "Dad," he said, "can we talk?" I stepped out onto the porch, rather than inviting him in. The December morning was cold and clear, the mountains sharp against the sky, the way they only got after a good wind had come through. "You're really going to cut off your own son over one mistake," he said. "I'm your blood. I'm all you have left." I looked at him for a long moment. "You're right," I said. "You are my son. That's exactly why what you did hurt the way it did. I gave you a home for 3 years, not because I owed you, not because I was afraid of being alone. Because I loved you. And you traded it for 3 dogs." He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "I'm not cutting you off," I said. "I'm stepping back from 30 years of moments I chose not to see clearly. That's different." I went inside. I closed the door behind me gently, the way Helen always closed doors. Because she said a door closed quietly, said more than one slammed ever could. I walked back to the reading room and sat down in my chair and picked up my book and found my page. The mountains were still there through the window. The house was quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. Not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of a place that had finally, after a very long time, been returned to itself. I turned the page. I spent 3 years giving more than I should have, and calling it love. That was my mistake. Not the giving without limits, without protecting what was mine to protect. If you are watching this, and you see yourself in this family story, maybe you are the one doing everything while others decide you are invisible. Hear me now. Do not wait for a safe deposit box to remind you of your worth. You already know your worth. You have always known. I am not a wise man. I am just an old repairman from Pasadena who finally stopped fixing things that were not broken and started fixing the one thing that was himself. God has a way of timing things perfectly. That old savings book sat in a wooden crate for 7 years, waiting for exactly the right moment. These grandpa stories are never just about money. This family story is about the quiet courage of ordinary people who choose dignity over convenience. Every grandpa stories you hear on this channel carries the same truth. It is never too late to stand in your own doorway and say, "This is mine." If this family story moved something in, you leave a comment below. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe these grandpa stories matter, subscribe so you never miss the next one. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. The stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted to carry real human truths. If that is not for you, no hard feelings, step away and find what speaks to your heart. But if you are staying, I am glad you are here.